Welcome to this Thursday edition of FreightWaves Now. I'm Emily Szink. We have a jam-packed episode for you today, but first we start with Zach Strickland. He's tracking Hurricane Dorian for you today.
Hey everyone, just to give you a quick update on Hurricane Dorian. Hurricane Dorian strengthened back to a strong Category 3 overnight last night, and it's still grinding along the coast of the Carolinas. What this is doing is drawing a bunch of storm surge up into the Wilmington area, creating a lot of concern for flooding here in the coastal areas of North and South Carolina. What that's going to do though, it's going to pick up speed and it's going to zip on off, but not before it skirts the coast, which is bad news because that means that a lot of these hurricane force winds have a strong chance of grinding along some of these land areas. So that's going to create extensive damage. We've already had flooding. Wind has already knocked out several power outages in the area. This is going to continue through tomorrow afternoon into late evening before zipping on off through the weekend. We've already seen capacity disruptions in Florida and also coastal Georgia down here. A lot of relief efforts throughout the weekend, so everybody needs to keep it tight over the weekend as this storm wraps up.
It's time for your Thursday brokerage update. Let's talk about some trends happening across the nation to close out that week. First off, let's jump in and talk about St. Cloud, Minnesota. As you can see, St. Cloud tender lead time at 2.88 days, so 3 days for freight to cover. Let's talk about what's been happening in terms of trends over the last few weeks. As you can see, huge run up in terms of outbound rejection, so a little bit of a capacity crunch that happened leading up into September. Before September 24th here, you can see those rejections were pretty flat, so very favorable for the brokers. Why are we talking about this today? Here you got your yellow line, your outbound tender volume elevated. So lots of options for carriers out of St. Cloud, but this white line here, your inbound tender volume trending up at a greater trajectory than that yellow line. So that's more inbound capacity coming into the market. You've got your outbound rejections trending down. So watch this one. At 3 days to cover, if you've got freight coming out of St. Cloud over the next few days into the weekend, possibly Monday, go ahead, stay on it, get it covered, get that margin. Let's go ahead, take a look at what's happening next. Cape Girardeau, Missouri, in the great central of the country. Same story, tender lead time up just a little bit, 1.7%. Same story, 3 days for this one to cover. As you can tell, we've got another situation where your outbound tender rejects are toppling back down. This white line here, your head haul index, measuring the inbound versus outbound capacity, your head haul trending back down. As the head haul's trending down, your rejections are trending down as well. That's going to be better margin for the brokerage aspect. Let's take a look next, seeing here your inbound tender rejections. We talk about outbound all the time, but you can't forget about the concept of inbound rejections. Down here you can see on this side your red blocks. Those are where the carriers are readily accepting freight into. Seattle, Washington down 30%. They're saying send them in. In terms of folks not wanting to go somewhere, up here Dubuque, Iowa, still struggling to get capacity back into that market. Montgomery, Alabama, Rock Island, Illinois as well. Let's close it out. Take a look at a map. Two maps. That's going to be your head haul map here on the right-hand side, and then on the left-hand side, your inbound tender market share. Once again, talking about what's headed inbound. Up here, Portland, Oregon, a lot of capacity inbound, not a lot of options for carriers headed out of there. As always, make sure you stay tuned to FreightWaves Now for your brokerage updates every single day.
Welcome to the Carrier Update presented by AT&T Business. Today I'd like to talk a little bit about the impact of Hurricane Dorian as it relates to the hours of service that truckers have to conform to. The current FMCSA exemption applies to about 10 states, and if we have a look at the chart behind me, what you'll see here is the yellow outline is relation to the 10 states, including Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, that have the hours of service exemption, which essentially means that Parts 390 to 399 of the Code of Federal Regulation, drivers are exempt from the hours of service if they're involved in the direct transportation of emergency relief freight. Over the weekend, if you've been following FreightWaves, you will have seen that there's been something like 300 to 500 trailers being staged here in Montgomery, Alabama. We posted all the pictures over the weekend. A lot of people said, why are you posting why are you staging freight so far away from where the hurricane was down here off the coast? The reason is that obviously the freight needs to be somewhere close to where emergency relief is required, but as of last week we weren't aware of exactly where the hurricane would make landfall. It turns out that Maxwell Air Force Base in Montgomery, Alabama is about 5 hours from where most of the flooding is going to occur now. So the reason we're talking about this today on the map here, and the different colours signify the amount of hours that drivers are driving on average every day. If you look right down the bottom here in the Florida and Lakeland market, you can see it's white, which means that on our legend down the bottom, that's the lowest number of hours that drivers are driving. They're down to about 5.5 hours a day, which is not surprising because a lot of the carriers have avoided that market. So in the Lakeland and Florida market, drivers' hours are down about 10%. This week as a result of it. And you can see that as we move up here, you've got more driving hours going on in some of the other areas as drivers are moving in and out of those areas. They've got exemptions to the 11 and the 10 in terms of 11 hours on duty and 10 hours off, so they can work more hours. It's important to remember that most carriers are aware of this, but not all drivers. What's really surprised me this week in talking to drivers, they were asking, what is the FMCSA hours of service exemption? How does it work? Well, it only works if you're involved in the specific haulage of relief freight. It also doesn't mean that you can get relief from the hours of service if you're stuck in harm's way. If you're stuck in harm's way and not hauling relief freight, you can use your 2 hours extra drive time as part of the adverse driving conditions exemption to get out of harm's way. It also means that if you're hauling freight into some of these emergency areas, once you're then off dispatch and not involved in the transport, you go back to normal hours of service duty. So this is in force until September the 28th. This is fairly standard for hurricane season, where there's a fairly wide exemption across a big part of the country where drivers are exempt from the hours of service. So that's important to remember, that not all drivers, if part of our carrier update today is make sure all of your drivers are aware of what's covered and what's not covered in particular. Last thing I want to cover today is the Canadian ELD mandate that's recently been announced. There's some significant difference between the US and the Canadian. This won't apply to all of the carriers that are already running cross-border. They've already have to have an ELD device in their truck that's compliant with the US. On the Canadian side, there are some significant differences. The big difference this year in terms of the mandate that's going to be coming in on June 2021 will be that there's no self-certification. In the US, there was a self-certification which allowed lots of people to come into the process and provide ELD software. A lot of those weren't compliant. The big difference with the Canadian ELD mandate is that there will be a third-party independent certifying body to ensure that the software is compliant to the new regulations that come in on June 2021. Other differences are the grandfathering. Here we had a grandfathering process where there was a 2-year grace period to allow existing ELD technology to be brought up to speed. That won't happen with the Canadian ELD mandate. So for those of you north of the border watching the carrier update, it's important to look at this exemption. It is different in terms of how it's going to be applied north of the border. Be aware that you need to be talking to your telematics vendors to make sure that they're compliant and ready to go and switch over.
Improve your fleet's efficiency with AT&T Fleet Complete, a 4G solution for tracking vehicles and simplifying ELD compliance. AT&T Fleet Complete, delivering fleet solutions for every business.
Today for our shipper update, Anthony Smith joins me. And Anthony, we are talking PMI, or Purchasing Managers Index. What is that?
That's right. So what it is it's a benchmark survey that goes out to purchasing managers on a monthly basis. And essentially what it can tell us is where they see the industry going from their perspective. And the big thing about it is now that the preliminary numbers were out initially showed below 50, that threshold of growth and expansion. Now it's in 49 level, so it's in contractionary territory with the finalized numbers for August.
So anything 50 is the benchmark. Anything below that is not good. And right now you were telling me that it's the lowest number in 3 years?
That's correct. It's been on a 35-month expansion period, now at the lowest point in about 35 months, 3 years. And really it's also going to start to play a role into our outbuy and tender rejection index as well, as we see less and less loads being rejected.
So when we're talking about PMI, we're talking about manufacturing, moving of goods. And if this number's below 50, that's not great for the economy. It's not great for moving things. Talk about that.
So it's not good for the economy. It's not good for moving manufacturing goods throughout the economy. One of the things that their respondents really honed in on was tariff fears. So it's not exactly overall cost of doing business, but with those added tariffs put into the mix, it's really become a wait and see attitude for a lot of the manufacturers. So it's really going to be something that's going to weigh on the second half of 2019. We're looking at manufacturing, and potentially on the consumer-facing sides of the economy, some of those costs can start to be passed on to the consumer. So that's something that we're all going to keep a close eye on.
So this is just one of the benchmarks looking at the economy and the overall health of it. And as you said, there are tariff fears and people aren't moving as much stuff. What does this mean for the second half of 2019 going even further into the third quarter? Not great news? Not
great news. And additionally, we saw that the new orders area for the PMI also went below 50. I think it's around 47 or so. So it's really a precursor of production and shipments being put out. And so when we see new orders also contraction, that gives us an idea of what to expect in the coming months, and not shaping up too strongly so far.
Do we see any change? Do we think this will change, or as long as those tariffs are in place, this number will continue to sit below 50?
I think that's really going to weigh on the purchasing managers in the second half. We might see a pull forward, so I believe there's going to be a second round of tariffs that are introduced mid-December. So there might be a pull forward to build up inventories to get ahead of those second rounds of tariffs coming up. But other than that, I don't think it's going to be enough to outweigh the overall fears and uncertainties going out throughout the second half of the year.
Yeah, for a few months we were talking about a really strong economy, but obviously things are starting to slow down, and this is something we will continue to watch. Again, Anthony Smith, thank you for joining us. Of course, you're watching on YouTube, so make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't done so. Also, make sure to like us on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. We hope everyone has a great Thursday.